After my parents got divorced, I was living with my mom, who worked a few different jobs just to keep the roof over our heads. Shout out to my mom. I would go to school and then I'd come home. And because she was not home, she was fearful of me going out into the world and adventuring around, although I did sometimes. And I did get in trouble. I was often alone in this, 4-bedroom household that her and my dad had cultivated together. And I did not know what to do with myself. So I recall in middle school diving heavily into music. Anytime I got a 4.0 on my report card, which was every semester or every time we received grades, I don't remember what they called them in middle school, but I was doing my work, so to speak. And every time I came home with a 4.0, my mom blessed me with anything that I wanted. And the only thing that I wanted was musical equipment and gear. So I went from having, the beautiful upright piano that I had, and then I had a DJ gear. They were belt-driven turntables. It was like a DJ in a box kind of kit. I don't recall where we got it from. I think it was like at the local music store where I later took guitar lessons at, because I ended up finding my mom's acoustic guitar from when she was in high school in her attic one day when I was home alone in this big old house. And I definitely started getting really, I don't know, what's the words? Started getting cabin fever, right? So I started just kind of looking around everywhere, and it led me to the attic. So I found her guitar, and this is besides the point. But anyways, anything I did that was awesome in school, I got an instrument for. So I basically ended up having a full stock, like, one-person band. And I could talk more about that at a different time. What I'm sharing all this for is to really touch on my solitude. And in those moments, my solitude became time for me to sharpen my blade, so to speak, right? I began to really dive into practicing these different instruments. I began to dive into practicing beat matching and practicing different things with DJing. I really, really dove into writing poetry at this time. It was the first time I wrote poetry. I believe I was in middle school. And anyways, so going from that sort of solitude to, continuing forward and moving to Arizona after being homeless at 22. And, the person I moved there with was always at work. And when I wasn't at school, I was at home in my solitude. And that's actually when I wrote one of my favorite albums, as well as like a fan favorite album. It's called Negative Space. It's the only long play album I've released, so the only LP I've yet released. And so, being out in Arizona by myself, that was a whole different world. I was culture shocked. My partner was always at work. I would visit them. I landed, a job there where I was making about $200 a month, which was pretty wild. And I was going to school every day, taking 3 buses to get to class. If I missed one, I had to wait a whole few hours to get on another one. And I'm pretty sure, I don't think this was before Lyft, but I sure as hell didn't have the budget for Lyft or Uber, right? So what I did was I really looked at, well, what can I do to process all of these feels that are coming up? And all that I could think to do was dive deeper into my work, dive deeper into my art. So I began to write. I began to produce an album called Negative Space. I began to really start writing. At that point, it was like blogs for Apsit Omen. I began to channel everything that I was going through into my what I feel to be my purpose, which is to make an impact and to make a difference and to help folks heal and to help folks lift up and navigate difficult times, right? And so with that said, it took me a while to actually get to that point of awareness. For a while, I was in the trenches of like depression, anxiety, noticing that I felt pretty freaking lonely being all the way out there in Arizona. I was going through some family changes. My grandma was, her health was deteriorating. She was my best friend. I would call her and talk to her every day, and things started to shift, and I started to feel the emotions from those shifts, which is natural because we're humans. And so I got to this point where I was like, I experienced hitting sort of a rock bottom out in Arizona, to be honest. And the rock bottom really showed me who were the solid players in my life, as well as who wasn't, as well as what I really needed to do to get to the point in which I could experience happiness in my life. And I began that journey there in Arizona, and I've continued it moving forward. I made a commitment to myself out there to only do what elevates my spirit, and to only do what makes me completely enthralled to be alive. Anything that does not, I give myself full permission to step away from, to end mid-conversation with, any of those sorts of things. I just let it go. And in Arizona, I got to that point, right? However, it took that difficult rock bottom emotionally to get there. And I've always been a fan. I've shared this already before. Like, I've studied like Eastern philosophies. Western folks typically call them religions. The studies that I've studied about them don't refer to them as religions. They refer to them as like thought practices, or they refer to them as just practices. Spiritual practices, right? So when I was out there, I was rereading this book called The Joy of Living. I'll link it in the comment section below for you to, in the description below for you to check out. It's one of my favorite books. I recommend it to everyone, right next to the Tibetan Art of Positive Thinking, which I believe I talked about in the intro episode of this podcast. I'll link that one also below. But those two books, I was rereading The Joy of Living, and The Joy of Living, it merges Buddhist understandings and beliefs with science. The person who wrote it shares like parallels between the two, right?